Is there anything useful that the Vikings can copy from the Eagles or the Chiefs that we learned in the Super Bowl? All that and so much more on the Locked On Vikings podcast. It's Twitter Tuesday.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3. You like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at LukeBraunNFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. You can also find this show on Amazon Fire or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Today on the show, it's Twitter Tuesday. That means I'm answering your questions. If you have any questions, you can always send them to me at Locked On Vikings or at Luke Braun NFL on Twitter. If I don't get to them right away, I might just be saving them for a mailbag. You can also fill out the Google form in the show notes or send an email to lockedonvikingspodcast@gmail.com. The first question that I'm going to answer today comes from 1991 Ford Tempo enthusiast who says, what lessons in team building do you think we could learn from this Super Bowl? So we talked about this a little bit on the Minnesota Football Party today, which you can find at Locked On Minnesota Sports. But I think that this is a more fruitless exercise. To me, it's just like a quick, easy stub article for a lot of people, but I don't know if it's like that useful of a way to analyze teams, because the situation that the Eagles are in is different from the one that the Chiefs are in, is different from the one that the Vikings are in, is different from the one that the Dolphins are in, is different from the one that everyone is in. I don't think that the Vikings should be basing their team building on something like, what if the Bengals hadn't shoved Mahomes out of bounds at the end there and given them at the end of the AFC Championship, right? What if Brock Purdy doesn't get hurt and the 49ers make a comeback? Are we talking about 7th round quarterbacks? Like there's just too many ways for that particular input to get skewed by something that isn't necessarily on that input's merit. And that's the point of football, right? Game of inches, and it's all volatile, and upsets happen and surprising outcomes happen and all that stuff. But there are two questions here to this point that I think are a little more salient. So one comes from Maurice Morth, who says, when is it time for the Vikings to draft a QB? So there's a ton of discourse about Jalen Hurts, basically. And hey, that was a second-round quarterback. They had Carson Wentz. They drafted a quarterback. It clearly worked out for them. Why don't the Vikings do that more often? Here's where I land on that. It's never going to be that hard to convince me that a quarterback pick was a good idea, just because of how important that position is. You're just never going to have to work that hard to talk me into it. That said, I didn't like the Kellen Mond pick, not because of the idea of drafting a quarterback, but because I thought Kellen Mond was more of a 3rd or 4th round guy. And that was already sort of working in the importance of quarterback. I think if you take a player that was at Kellen Mond's level as a prospect, put him at any other position, I'm saying, maybe that's a day 3 kind of swing dude. And then you pump it up to third or 4th round. Just based on positional importance. But I think second round, pick 66. I mean, was it 60? It was like the second pick in the 3rd round. So I guess technically a 3rd round pick, but it was their second pick in that draft. That was a lot. And I think it was just like a reach on that guy. But the answer to that question really depends on the guy. And I don't have a great sense for any of the quarterbacks in this class yet. I will get to them, but I don't have a specific answer. But somebody like Anthony Richardson, who I know is, the toolsy but raw kind of guy. Maybe I think he's a 2nd rounder. But if you talk about somebody like Hendon Hooker, maybe I think he's a 5th rounder. And so it depends on who you're saying. But the idea in general is always going to be, take swings at the most important position in the world, of course. Arch asks, the Chiefs did a lot of smart quick game with gadget players to prevent pressure. Could we see the same with our own gadget players? Also, I wonder if there's any similarities with the aggressive defenses that Spagnuolo incorporates and the one Flores has, like being multiple and hybrid players. To the second part, yeah, sure. I don't know the Steve Spagnuolo defense all that well, so I can't speak to it too much. But to the first part, multiplicity is great. Having good pressure packages is always nice. How often you go to those is a more subjective call, but having good pressures that work, obviously that's an asset. Uh, to the point about quick game, I do think that that is an element that the Vikings sort of missed, but it was kind of refreshing because they went to quick game way too often in 2021. That was one of my biggest gripes with the 2021 Clint Kubiak offense. It's one of my biggest gripes with the 2018 DiFilippo offense, and it's why I compared the two a lot over that year, was because it really seemed like their answer to the O-line is getting beat was to get the ball out quick and do quick game. But quick game can be defended very easily. And if your O-line is just getting beat by a 4-man rush and they can kind of dedicate their coverage to, too high in quick game, that can sort of get suffocated. And I think for the most egregious one version of that I remember was 2016's offense. The Sam Bradford, Pat Shurmur, dump it off kind of thing was really rough. And that was why it was, everything, the average depth of target was like 4, like it was horrible. And, every pass was 2-yard complete, tackled, 2-yard complete, tackled. Now it's 3rd and 6 and you threw it 2 more yards, like that was really frustrating. So I don't go too far into it, but the Chiefs did it because of the weapons that they have just aren't deep guys. I mean, Kadarius Toney and Juju Smith-Schuster kind of, but I think he was better served being able to try to be a playmaker, get it off to running backs. Travis Kelce can do anything, but their personnel really was more well suited to getting the ball out quickly and making plays after the catch. Where if you look at like the 2016 Vikings, they had Diggs and Thielen. I mean, those are deep receivers. Those guys should be on home run shots. And intermediate shots. You should be trying to get chunks with those guys, not dump it off for 4 yards and rely. Like their routes are so good, you're wasting it, right? So it depends on the personnel. But I would love to see that element, right? If we're looking at who the wide receivers that the Vikings should take, maybe in the draft or whatever. If you give me like after catch juice, I'm going to be that much more into the prospect for sure. Stralwiot says, do you think the FO actually targets a CB in round 1, or do we go with another position like linebacker? Linebacker would be a pretty crazy one. I'm in the middle of watching Trenton Simpson from Clemson right now, so I'll get back to you on him. But it's certainly not a lock. It was going to be the favored outcome for sure, just how bad the room is right now. But hey, depending on how free agency goes, maybe they just throw all of their free agency at cornerback, and then that way they don't have to touch it at all in the draft, right? Now you're looking at receivers or centers or something like that. Like that would be a perfectly valid way to approach the offseason. So it's a way easier question to answer like 2 months from now. But for now, if I had to bet on a position, I'd pick corner, but it's not crazy at all to imagine them taking a wide receiver or like I mentioned, like a quarterback or an edge rusher or an offensive lineman. You can really justify a lot if you're in love with the prospect. I have a ton of questions. I'm going to have to rip through some of these real fast. So get ready for a lot of content. But first, this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is online therapy made easy. And therapy is not a crisis thing. It's not an emergency thing. It's not necessarily something you go to like fix what's wrong in your brain, and you don't have to like come to that conclusion. It's maintenance. I've been in therapy for 3 years now, and it has been a really important part of I feel like I've grown a lot as a person. I feel like I've realized a better version of me, and I cannot recommend that enough. So to get started, go to BetterHelp.com, and they can help get you hooked up with the right therapist. They can help you try many different people, consults with many different people, and it's all done online and comfortably, however you are comfortable. It's flexible, affordable, and it can get you set up with a therapist who is right for you, which is an underrated part of this. Finding the right person is something that you should put a lot of work into if you're going to get into this. Just fill out a brief questionnaire, and you can get matched with a licensed therapist. Switch therapists anytime for no additional charge, and that's the big deal for me. If you want to live a more empowered life, therapy can get you there. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. Thanks so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. For your second listen, or I guess watch, go to patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL and watch that first video that says Let's Count Beans and get to know the salary cap, so you too can understand all the wizardry that Rob Brzezinski pulls off. But for now, we are going to continue on with this Twitter Tuesday mailbag. Michael Green asks, odds that the Vikings keep both Smith and Thielen. Speaking of things you can listen to after this show, go listen to a week ago's podcast, Monday's podcast. I think that is the favored outcome. I'm not going to put percentages on it, but I think that's the most likely thing because there is a middle ground between what the Vikings would save if they cut both of those players, and both their contracts are similarly enough structured for this to work in both cases, and what those guys would make on the open market. So there's like a middle ground where the Vikings can save more, and you can basically go up to Thielen or Smith and say, hey, we can pay you more than the free agent market's going to pay you, and it'll still be worth it for us. Will you take that, or will you take your chances? And I think that that's a pretty good deal that they can offer those guys that I would guess that they take. But of course, anything's possible, and I'm not going to be say anything in absolutes. I'm not that egotistical. Max Garcia asks, after seeing the Eagles abusing the rugby scrum-like QB sneak, do you think a rule change will happen to prevent the formation/play? So there's a big debate on this that I had today. Here's where I fall on it. If you don't think that that's like unfair enough to be worth banning, I'm more sympathetic to that. But I do think that there could be something. So I see this playing one of two ways. Either it just goes away and then that's fine. But I think what happens is next year, everybody installs it. And every 3rd and 1 is dominated by it. Because I'm not sure, like the Eagles have a really elite unit. I mean, they had an elite offensive line, and that was part of it. But I don't know if that's like a necessary ingredient to this succeeding. And I think in reality, if there were a rule change, it would be something like outlawing pushing the ball carrier from behind, which also feels a little bit more in this, like if it's football is not like a scrum of pushing, and it always feels a little bit cheap if, you know, your running back gets tackled, but then the offensive lineman comes up and picks him up and pushes him because he's bigger than the safety and the running back that tackled him. Like it feels a little bit like, wait, the O-line's just doing he might as well be the ball carrier now. And that's kind of, I don't know, it feels a little bit off of the way that things are supposed to work. So if there were a rule change, I would say that. And then there are also, I think, safety reasons to say no pushing a guy from behind because it just adds a force that's going to eventually lead to awkward stuff. I think there's an argument to do that. And if you don't do that, then I think you see a year where it dominates super hard, and then you see it happen. Because I think that even if you don't have an elite offensive line, this can sort of be a way for them to overperform. But I also think the solve is really easy. You just make it sniffers instead. And then you just keep as long as the ball carrier is behind the scrum, and that shouldn't change the amount of like strength and power, then I think it's fine. And so I think you can make a fairly innocuous rule change that turns this into something that the game can willingly accept. You Matter asks, why didn't we see much this year from Kene Nwangwu, and will we see more of him next season? I do think you'll see more of him next season, if only because Alexander Madison's a pending free agent, and as of this moment, I don't think that there's any indication that the Vikings will bring him back. And you might even lose Dalvin Cook too. We'll see what they do there. It's a really good year to need a running back. The draft class is really thick around the middle, around the 4th-ish round, which is a decent time to get a running back. There's really interesting options in free agency as well if you wanted to go that way. And so this might be a time where we end up with like a committee, and that's the way that a lot of other McVay teams have gone, and maybe the Vikings go running back by committee now. And Nwangwu would for sure be part of that committee, but why he didn't play? I think the answer is simple, and it's not good news. It means he just got beat by Alexander Madison and Dalvin Cook. Just wasn't better than those guys, and why would you put a worse player on the field? Why that is, who's to say, right? I didn't see how he practiced, so I can't speak to that, and maybe we'll find out if he plays next year and he's bad or whatever. Ingram's left foot asks, do we think the Lambeau Grounds crew was vacationing in Arizona the past few weeks? Okay, here's the deal with the quote-unquote playing conditions. Grass gets wet, y'all. That's how it goes. Indoor is a little interesting. I think they probably could have dried that off more, but the way grass plays is just different. And the Eagles were affected by this more than the Chiefs were. I do think that it is a valid competitive advantage to be the team that's better prepared for the playing surface. And it's not like this was a surprise. The NFL was working on this for like 2 years, and I think that this sod thing was I think it's a good initiative too, because it is an attempt to replace turf that has led to a lot of knee injuries. If you don't like knee injuries, you should be rooting for this to succeed. Um, Now, busting it out in the Super Bowl and making that the testing ground is a decision. Maybe that is better for like a preseason or something, but I guess if it's the last game of the season, you don't want to bust out a bad playing surface and have a million people tear their ACLs right on the cusp of the season either. So I can see the argument there. But I think this is more on the Eagles for not adapting to this than it is on like the grounds crew. Maybe that's a hot take, but I don't think that the vitriol over the like gardeners is enough. They're trying something new to solve a problem. I can always respect that. But you knew you were playing on grass. So I don't know. I'm not sympathetic to Justin Jefferson for slipping all over Lambeau Field either. Figure it out. This is a professional organization. Figure out how to play on the surface. Caleb Cook asks, if the NFL banned the Vikings, which team would you be a fan of in the future? I don't know if I could do it. The Vikings are such an integral part of my experience of football. And I've even tried, like, I don't have a college team really. The college I went to doesn't have a football team. So I don't have a college football team. And I've tried to get into college football teams. I've tried to be like, I'm a Sooners fan now. And it just didn't stick. And then now last year I rooted for Pitt and that didn't really stick. And like, I didn't watch all the games. Like, I can't force it. It has to be organic. And I think the only thing that I will have the amount of like passion and love and emotion for that I have for the Vikings can only be the Vikings. I don't think I can just like apply it to someone else. I probably would just find a new hobby, honestly. DJ, two last names, says Lamar Jackson. Probably not. So if you want Lamar Jackson to be a Viking, you probably have to hope that it happens next year. The Ravens are going to franchise tag this dude. Like, they have no indication of trading him. Like, they absolutely can franchise tag him. It feels like a lock and a half that they're just going to franchise tag him and he'll be a Raven next year. And there's nothing that Lamar Jackson himself can do about it. And Lamar Jackson has been, I mean, he's a little bit annoyed, I think, at the way that some things have gone in Baltimore. But it's not like Derek Carr, where you can like, he is just going to leave and he's being released today. So like, it's not like that situation. It's not like the Aaron Rodgers situation where you just genuinely don't know. It feels like there's a lot of wishful thinking about maybe my team could have Lamar Jackson, but like next year though, it'll be that much harder to franchise tag him. Next year I could see it being a better option. And also as it stands right now, by next year, Kirk Cousins wouldn't be a Viking. In this case, Kirk Cousins is still a Viking, so you'd have to trade him, and then he would have to waive his no-trade clause, which is maybe the unlikeliest premise in all of this. I don't think so. Purple Drank says, now that ISM is Super Bowl champion adjacent, how much crow do we as Vikings/Bears fans have to eat? I don't know, man. He was on the practice squad. Talk to me when we've given up on a guy on the active roster, but we don't have to do this. Every time a player who was a former Viking goes on to have like any success, like when you get rid of a guy, it's because you didn't want to pay the cost of that guy. And neither did the Chiefs. They just had him on the practice squad. Like, it's the Vikings didn't want him in the Chiefs, and he didn't like meaningfully really contribute to the game. Like, he was on the practice squad. He was a depth guy. Dime a dozen. We don't have to freak out about it. And I know we all want to be the most woe is me about look at all these former Vikings thriving elsewhere. But if you look at it on the whole, when guys get cut from a team, it's pretty rare that they go on that the team was just like that wrong about it. It's one in 100 kind of deal. I have a whole bunch more questions, and I do want to make sure that I get to them because they are very fun, and I love you all for sending them. So thank you. But first, let me talk to you about the best tasting protein bar on the planet. It's Built Bar. Built Bar, covered in 100% chocolate in ridiculous flavors like cookies and cream, double chocolate, coconut puffs, churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, all kinds of delicious stuff. Really great for that sweet, sweet craving. And it's not going to knock you off the wagon. It's like 130 calories. 17 grams of protein in one of these bad boys too. Like, it is a protein bar, but your lizard brain isn't going to know that. And that is the glory of Built. Also, you can go buy them in person. If you need them right now, you can go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and you can just pick up a box, or you can always go to built.com, get it delivered right to your door. So head on over to Walmart or Sam's Club or just online, get yourself some Built Bar. Wrapping up this Twitter Tuesday episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast. The next one comes from Grady Wempy, who says, do you think that Keely Ringo, quarterback out of Georgia, is a better fit than Christian Gonzalez? And if so, why? So if you want my thoughts on Christian Gonzalez, listen to yesterday's episode. If you want my thoughts on Keely Ringo in more depth, I will do an episode on that probably sooner than later. He's one of the only guys I've watched. The only other guy I've watched. Trenton Simpson and then those two corners. That's all I've done so far. So is he a better scheme fit? On just scheme fit, probably, because he's more of a man-to-man corner. And Christian Gonzalez is a press bail, zone, 3-match corner, and that's probably not how Brian Flores is going to do things here. So just on scheme fit, yes, Keely Ringo's a better scheme fit. That said, I have Christian Gonzalez 2, maybe 3 rounds above Keely Ringo on the board that I'm still sort of moving it. All of that is subject to a lot of change with the combine and all that stuff. But Keely Ringo he's going to blow out the combine. He's going to test really fast. But to me, he's 20 years old, and I think he's been the fastest dude on the field for his whole career. And therefore, there's a lot of technique stuff that is really wrong. His feet at the line of scrimmage are terrible. He gets dusted off the line of scrimmage a lot. You can watch red zone touchdowns happen on him because of that. He's big. He's like, I think my comp for him was if you took Xavier Rhodes' body, put Piers Morgan's brain in it, and asked that to play cornerback. Like he's going to go down as like, oh, he's the raw, traitsy, athletic guy. Kind of like Tariq Woolen happened in this draft class. And I think Tariq Woolen, he went in the 3rd round, right? I think that is appropriate. Christian Gonzalez will probably go in the top 20. And I think that's appropriate, assuming the team that takes him is in the right scheme for him. Otherwise, I think he's probably more of a late first. Keely Ringo, there's so much assembly required with him that I would much rather have Christian Gonzalez, even though I think he's not as good of a scheme fit. He's just a better corner. Even if you're only asking him to play man-to-man, I would rather take that than Keely Ringo man-to-man right now, just because there's a lot less teaching that you have to do, a lot less developing that you have to do, and therefore a better chance that he gets to a point that he's a starting quality guy, whereas Keely Ringo, he's going to need time and patience, and that's not what I want to do, especially with people mocking him in the 1st round. I don't want to pick a 1st-round guy that you just can't hear from for the first 2 years of his rookie contract. Landon Renly says, have Madden's overalls been harmful to how people look at / evaluate players? Yes and no. Madden has been such a great in for so many people to get involved in football, and it's been a great gateway for people. And I think that's awesome that it gets people interested in football. And ideally, you play Madden and then you go, I want to know more about how the real sport works. And then you sort of discard Madden and move on. But I think it's just human nature. We want to boil things down to something easily digestible. So we want an overall rating, or we want a PFF grade, or we want something that quantifies how good is this player. If that's what you're looking for, if you just want rankings of how good everybody is, you are not going to like my draft coverage, because I am going to stray away from that as much as possible. I have a big board and I'll have kind of my organization. Who would I take over who? But it's going to be very loose and vague, and I'm going to focus more on getting you to understand the ins and outs of this player, and then you can make your own decision on where you would take that. If you don't agree with me that somebody like Keely Ringo, for example, who is going to be a crazy athlete, but just doesn't have the experience and skills and technique, and there's so much he has to learn. If you think that guy should be a 1st-round corner, that's totally valid. And I'm not going to argue with you on that, but I just want to make sure that we're on the same page about what that package is. That's way more important to me. So yeah, if you're the kind of person that has played Madden and that's kind of your only really in-depth football experience, come on a journey with me. All right. Because I think we can all grow together. Jay Hine asks, why were the 2 touchdowns scored by the Chiefs with motion, not an illegal shift? My understanding is that players cannot be in motion outside of the tackles unless they stop moving and are set for 1 full second before the snap. I have never seen the outside the tackles part of that rule. Watching it back, it does look like they were pretty close there, so they might just give it to you. But I was unfamiliar with that part of the rule. I kind of figured that as long as you're not going backwards, you can be running wherever. But I don't know. Send me a screenshot of the rule book if you have that part. Maybe there's a conspiracy here. Skull Actuary says, curious, how much thought should/will be given to scheme fit versus scheme versatility in the draft, especially in regards to defensive players? That depends on who you are. For a team like with Christian Gonzalez, and what we talked about yesterday, if he does fit your scheme, then his scheme versatility doesn't matter because you're going to ask him what he does best. And that might mean you get him at a better value, because what if the Vikings picked 10th and they passed on Christian Gonzalez because they said, he's not a scheme fit. You picked 12th, he's a scheme fit for you, and you would rather have him than a scheme versatile guy, but who's not as good as all the things. Then that kind of advantages you. So sometimes it helps to look for players that fit you and only what you do. You got a better chance to get them. But scheme versatility is never going to be a bad thing, especially in a world where, hey, we don't know if this D coordinator, what if Brian Flores sucks and he gets fired and we go back to zone match again? Well, we better hope we didn't try to build a bunch of players that were trying to do just that. That's also part of this with like these young guys like Scene and Booth. Did we draft them to do a Fangio thing and now we're not doing the Fangio thing? Did we screw this up? You'd rather have somebody with a little more versatility. And for what it's worth, I don't think that's the case with those guys, but you get what I'm getting at there. It's all about less about, is this guy a zone match guy? And more about, this guy's a press bail guy. That's really like, what does he do? He plays press bail. What scheme uses that? Zone match. But every scheme can use some press bail. He plays press bail. Can you use press bail? I want to hone in more on the specifics there, I guess. Mediocre in Montevideo asks, new rule for discussing rosters and salaries. No player's contract can ever again be expressed in millions, only percentage of the cap. Agreed. Yeah, I think that's great. Percentage of cap is absolutely a better way to look at it. It's hard. It can get really confusing with that, with like roster bonuses and proration and all that stuff. But percent of cap is always a good part of that equation. You should always, always, always look at it. I don't mind the millions thing, just because when you start getting to 8.7%, 12.7% plus a 0.3% workout bonus and stuff, and when you get like $500,000 workout bonuses and it's 0.042%, that can get a little more difficult to digest. So I don't mind it being in millions, like still having that as part of it, but percent of cap is absolutely something you should pay attention to. Logan Shadler asks, favorite Viking ever? It's always been Chris Carter for me since I was a kid. He was the guy I had posters of growing up. And then when Randy Moss came, it kind of became both of them. But for a dark horse, go all the way back to Joe Cap. You can actually find a video from last summer on Locked On Vikings, or a podcast on Joe Cap. Go listen to that or go watch the history doc at my Patreon page. Sam asks, if you could go back, would you still have made that much cornbread? So that's probably from the pictures that I posted of our Super Bowl spread. We made a whole bunch of stuff. We did Philly cheesesteaks. We did barbecue sandwiches, homemade hoagies, which was really fun. We made a lot of cornbread. My girlfriend made the cornbread. It's a family recipe of hers. So she made a lot. She made like a big old loaf of it and plus some muffins because she's trying to nail the recipe too. So no regrets. And when you host a party and you made too much food, that's never a bad thing. So absolutely not a single regret in the world. Finally, Squeaks asks, you are awoken in the middle of the night by a spooky spirit who says, I have seen the future. The Vikings trade for a new starting QB. If you can guess who it is, I will grant you 3 wishes. Who is your guess and what would be your wishes? You can wish for more wishes. Okay, well, I will wish for more wishes in perpetuity until I have a stranglehold on the entire world and I am its benevolent dictator. So that we'll do that part first. My guess, that's really fun. So if I'm told, okay, they are trading, that means they're trading Cousins away. And I think the most likely outcome there would probably be San Francisco. If we were setting in stone that Kirk Cousins gets traded away, he gets traded to San Francisco, and you probably get somebody back from San Francisco. I am going to guess that somebody would be Brock Purdy. I think that they stick with Trey Lance, and then they try to give up, and then they give back Brock Purdy and like a ton of picks. But they don't have the picks, so actually that doesn't really work as well, huh? It's not Derek Carr because he's getting released. It would be very funny if it were Rodgers, but it's not going to be Rodgers. Well, like what other quarterbacks are on the trade market that would like make sense there? Like, is there a Ryan Tannehill angle here, or maybe it's a Trey Lance angle and they go with Purdy? Yeah, I'll go with that. My guess would be Trey Lance, and then they go with Purdy. Yeah, hometown kid, right? Yeah, I'll go with Trey Lance as my guess, and with my wish, I wish for world power and unstoppability. And I will silence all of the critics. Tomorrow on the show, we'll probably talk about the press conference. Brian Flores is going to be introduced to the media on Tuesday, so we will be able to talk about anything interesting that comes up there. Hopefully we'll have a sense for what's going to happen with the rest of the defensive staff, and we can kind of continue on. I'll see y'all then for that. And as always, Skol.